Hi, everybody. I'm Sandy Price, and I am your instructor in ethics for nonprofit and public administration professionals. I want to talk to you not so much about the class, but I want to try to wet your whistle a little bit for what we're going to be doing here in our ethics course this semester. First of all, I don't know if you know this, but there are actually 4 ethical frames that Western society expects you to be aware of. For the most part, there are very few people who are even aware that they are aware of 1 or 2 of them. They don't think of them as frames. We just think of ourselves as ethical people. If I asked you if you felt you were ethical, 98% of you would tell me yes. And the other 2% of you would say, well, I try to be ethical, but I don't always live up to the top. But the point being that most of us do try our darndest to be ethical people. But we don't really know that society is holding us responsible for 4 completely different ethical frames. And if we ever get into trouble, the kind of trouble that we read about in the newspaper, unfortunately, almost every day, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it's because we are really well skilled at 1 or maybe even 2 of these ethical lenses that we don't even know that we're skilled at. We don't know that they have names. But we did not know to look through the 3rd and the 4th lens, and consequently, something slipped by. So let's talk really fast about these 4 ethical lenses. So the first one is a teleological lens, and that's Latin for basically the greatest happiness. And that's a cost-benefit analysis. We're looking at the consequences of a decision choice. What's going to make the most people happier? What's going to make the society better off of all of our choices? And this is a really important analysis, and a lot of us do this particular analysis. And I'll give you an example. If you had a natural disaster somewhere and you had to decide where to put up your temporary structure where people were going to come in and get helped, or maybe have to stay there until the disaster had been cleared away or whatever, trying to make decisions about where you're going to place this thing so that the most possible people can have the easiest access to it is a teleological decision, and it does carry some ethical consequences, because if you put it close to the pretty spot because you've traveled here from another place and you want to sit here in this beautiful spot, that may completely ignore, you probably wouldn't do that, but it's just a silly example. So that's a teleological analysis is how can you help the most people? Another possible teleological conversation would be you've got medically underserved areas and you can bring medical doctors in a bus once every 6 months or so, or you can make medical doctors available on a much more frequent basis by Skype. There is something about bringing doctors directly to the patients and having them interact and have that personal connection that is important to medical practice and to the ethics of medical practice. But there is also something about being able to serve more people more frequently than 6 months. And so that would be a sort of a teleological, where is the greatest good in that? And I'm not answering that question. I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff to consider, and cost benefit isn't all about money. All right, so that's teleological, and a couple of examples, one of them pretty bad. Anyway, deontological is the next frame, and that's basically principles, rules. What principle would you apply in this situation? So one principle or rule that most of us are very familiar with in our regular lives is do unto others as you would have others do unto you, the golden rule, right? And we probably learned that pretty early, along with don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, and don't pull your sister's pigtail, right? So there are also rules and principles that actually derive from particular situations, societal expectations of us in certain situations, and also societal expectations of us that go with roles that we play. So we all have different roles in society. If you are a parent, you have ethical duties from your role of, keep a roof over your kids' head, make sure they have food, give them comfort, keep them safe, and so forth. If you are an adult child of an aging parent, you have, some kind of a duty to make sure that they get cared for into their own old age, that they get cared for with some sort of, they have some comfort, they are able to preserve their dignity, that they get medical care, whatever they need, that sort of thing might be your duties as an adult child. Now you move into your professional roles. Of course, these roles also have duties attached, right? If you think about a doctor, a medical profession, the first rule we think of there is first do no harm, right? Okay, so there are others actually that go with being a doctor. If you are a teacher, you have ethical responsibility. For example, if you learn that something's going on in one of your students' private lives, some kind of abusive situation, you are bound to report it. Conversely, if you happen to be the lawyer of that same abuser, you are duty bound by your profession not to report it unless, and this is an exception to your rule of confidentiality with your client, you happen to know they're about to go do it again, in which case that's an exception to that rule. But I point out this one abuser, teacher, lawyer, they both have very different duties based on their roles, right? And we could get into that, probably will later. But anyway, there are all of these rules, some of which are generic, like the golden rule, and some of which are very specific to the roles that we have. And we will be talking in class about the duties and principles that we need to apply because we work in organizations or government agencies, and because we have a role as a fiduciary for our organizations or representative of our citizenry or whatever is the case in your particular job, that there are a lot of duties, and that's the deontological analysis there, both generic and specific to your role. The third ethical frame in our community is the virtue frame, and I like to call that one the what would blank do. For many of my students, it's actually like, the wristband. It's what would Jesus do? You come into a tough situation and you might ask yourself, what did Jesus have to say about situations like this? Or how would Jesus have acted in this situation? But it doesn't have to be Jesus. It could be anybody that you think has a lot of integrity and has proven themselves someone that is upstanding, and you might like to model yourself after them. I happen to be Jewish, so Jesus isn't, my guy. And when I fill in that blank, oftentimes I fill in the blank with what would my grandmother have done. I was an oldest grandchild. I got, a lot of her time and a lot of her wisdom. And looking back on her life, she has given me a lot to think about. And so sometimes when I get into a tough situation, I basically think to myself, my grandmother said about this, or how might she have acted in this situation? What lead might she have given me that I could follow? But it could be anybody. What would Gandhi have done? What would Margaret Thatcher have done? What would Martin Luther King have done? Who do you look up to? It would be that person that you might fill in that blank with. So anyway, that is the third one. And let's just kind of look at a situation where a virtue analysis and a teleological analysis might create a conflict. And I want to specifically focus on this whole idea that the end justifies the means. So let's say that you are, and this is a real situation that came up for me, you are the executive director or a board member for the American Academy of Pediatrics. I happen to be the interim director for the American Academy of Pediatrics Arizona chapter for a little over a year when they needed an interim director. And during that time, Coca-Cola offered a pretty big grant to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And that money would have gone a long way toward whatever kinds of research and work that the American Academy of Pediatrics was in the middle of doing, and it would have had a great good. But the virtue analysis was, the pediatricians said, what would people think of us as pediatricians who are supposed to be protective of children's health if we took money from a company that basically puts sugar in their beverages, and we know that sugar causes a great deal of medical care problems for children, and also has, I can't remember what the chemical is, but it's like phos something. If you look on the back of a can of regular cola, you will see PHO phos S pH something, and that is a chemical substance that literally eats away at bone tissue, and it makes children's teeth bad, and it also weakens their bones, and it just gives a head start to it just keeps kids from being as sturdy as they should be. Anyway, what the doctors were basically saying was, if we accept this money, we're going to have it's going to impugn our reputations. So the analysis of what good the money could do was teleological, but then it was overlaid with a virtue analysis of, do we want to look like this? Is this really who we are? Is this integrity? Is this the character that we want to portray, or the reputation we want to create for ourselves? And the answer was no, and they turned down the money. And you can see how it's really important here that they looked at it both from a teleological perspective, but also from a virtue perspective. Now, what's the fourth frame? The fourth frame is that thing that we say when we say, we'll know if it's right or wrong because we'll feel it in our gut, right? Our gut. And I just have to say, our gut is not a separate brain that analyzes things for us. Our gut actually, this has been studied by cognitive psychologists and neurobiologists, both fields actually. And what we have learned about what we know with our gut is that it's actually something subconscious going on below the surface. And we'll talk about this in more detail later, but just to give you a little feel for it, we can't walk into a situation where we have just moments to assess, do we like this person? Do we like this idea that's being presented to us? How do we feel about what we're seeing in front of us in an interaction between people? And we have just literally moments or seconds to assess what's going on and make a decision. This is an okay thing. This is a bad thing. We need to intervene here. We need to run, whatever it is. Or this is really good. We love it. And so what's happening is our brains are little computers, and fast, they are looking through our file cabinet of past experiences or things that we know or that we've heard about, and assessing if there's anything in that file cabinet that reminds us of the situation in front of us. And if there is, if that situation reminded us of something that we liked a great deal, then we will project something positive. If it reminds us of something that upset us, that we had an emotional reaction to, that we thought was bad, etc., then ultimately what happens is we project that negative feeling into that situation as well. Now, the good news is we can actually kind of quickly, and we'll learn how to do this, get at what those memories are, even though they're subconscious. And it's really important sometimes that we be able to do that, because the problem with those gut feelings is that analysis that our brain did subconsciously is very shallow. It's just looking at the surface for like patterns, similar patterns. What it isn't doing is going too far below the surface to see whether this situation that it's found to compare to the one in front of us is actually closely enough similar that it's okay to project our feelings and our thinking about something that happened in the past on this situation. And a lot of times it isn't. Many times it is. It's a great coping mechanism. Really fast, it helps you assess, do I run from this tiger? Do I stay? But in some cases where it's an ethical thing, we are projecting bad information onto the situation in front of us. And we'll talk about how you can sort out whether you should trust your gut or whether you should not trust your gut in any particular circumstance. By the way, not everybody feels it in their gut. I have had people tell me that their scalp tingles or that they get tightness through their jaw and their neck muscles. Some people right here. So anyway, I don't know where you feel your gut, but again, it's not its own separate analysis tool. It's your brain doing this amazing little fast calculation that we will learn more about later. So anyway, those are the four. And just to bring this back to where I started, if you have done your utmost best in good faith to try to sort through a sticky problem and you've come to a conclusion, but the whole thing blew up anyway, even though you did your best to try to figure out the right way to move forward ethically, when your boss or your board member or that journalist shows up in your office and you explain to them that you did this beautiful cost benefit analysis, and you looked at what was going to be best for the organization, and here's why, and here's all your, whatever. And then that board member says to you, didn't you think about how this would make us look, what this was going to do to our reputation? You're fired. Or maybe not, but you know what I'm saying. So you need to be able to figure out which of these ways you primarily look at ethical lenses, and we're going to work on that. Whether it is, that you are always looking at the best, the best outcomes, whether it is that you have rules that you feel you need to apply, whether you are doing this virtue analysis, or whether you're trusting your gut. At any rate, you're responsible for all four, and we'll talk about that more later. Now, I do really quickly want to make the point that there are way more than 4 ethical frames out there, but these are the 4 the Western society hold. If you think about the front page test, right? If you saw it on the front page, you've got to be able to answer all 4 of these for you to come out looking sweet on the front page. But karma is an Eastern ethical frame that a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us have adopted into our way of looking at the world. There is a feminist ethical frame. Some of our religious backgrounds bring ethical frames with them. There's very definitely a Catholic ethical frame, a Jewish ethical frame, a Muslim ethical frame that goes along with. And later when we talk about ethical engagement, one of the things that we'll talk about is that you have to consider the cultural frame along with those 4 ethical frames. What community are you working in, and what are the specific ethical frames that go with that community? Native Americans, for example, have a very strong sense of ethics that is kind of different than the one that surrounds them in the larger America that their cultures are in the middle of. So I don't want to leave you thinking that there are just those 4, but we're going to focus on those 4 because if you are being held responsible in your professional roles, whatever those turn out to be, it will be very helpful for you to be good at analyzing any complicated ethical issue that comes up that isn't easy to sort out. It doesn't have to do with pulling your sister's pigtails. It's a lot more complicated than that by looking at it from all 4 of these frames. That is just part of what we're doing this semester, but it is a big and important part. And so I will leave you with that. And in the other video that comes after this one, you will find a course overview and a little tour around the classroom. And I apologize for the shaking of the computer, but my dear friend Lucy here wants some attention. So I will see you on the board. Have a great rest of your week.